No, 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 no. We will not allow this nation to relegate our contributions, that is, the African American contribution to this country, to a mere 28-day period. That is the month of February. We will not allow that to happen. The shortest month of the year. We won't allow it to happen because Black history is American history in 6 stages. Stay with me and I'll explain what I'm saying. Hello, everybody. I am attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers, and each and every week we bring you at least one trending story having to do with politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to do 2 things: defy this unjust legal system and to nullify systemic racism. If that interests you, and I sure hope it does, please subscribe, like, share, comment, and click the bell so you'll get notified every time we upload one of these videos. Now, before I get into this subject, let me take a moment to express my sincere gratitude. We reached the 10,000 subscriber milestone just a couple of days ago. That is a major milestone for us. But yes, thank you, each and every one of you. Thank you so very much. It's exciting. I am fired up about it, and it deserves an applause. Yeah, there it is. It deserves a round of applause. So thank you again. Okay, so let's get into this. Black history is American history. Let's go to another screen. Black history is American history. You can't separate the two. You can't separate African American history from American history. You can't separate American history from African American history. We have made serious contributions to this nation. Now, a group of Englishmen settled Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. It was the first known English colony. The first known English colony. However, Africans had already been in what would become America approximately 40 to 50 years earlier. And of course, some people would argue that African Americans had been here long before that. I'm not getting into that debate, but history certainly shows that we were here from the absolute beginning of this nation. So how do you think you're going to relegate all that we have done for this nation to just 1 month? I mean, that is a type of segregation. It's like you're separating out the Black contribution to this nation. We're not going to let that happen. Now, we appreciate Black History Month on the calendar. We appreciate that. We absolutely appreciate that. But we want it understood that African Americans are intertwined with the founding, the development, the growth of America, and we haven't been, quite frankly, we haven't been compensated for all that we've done for this nation. We haven't really been treated right despite all that we've done. So let's talk about the 6 stages that I told you that American history, at least from the African American perspective, can be separated into. The first stage, obviously, is slavery. Now, white Americans brutally enslaved Black Americans as chattel for 246 years, which gave white Americans early advantages, huge advantages, economic advantages, political advantages, social advantages, and all other types of advantages because of that 246-year period where African Americans were considered chattel under the law. I want to bring that home to you. I have done my family background search, and you're looking at a literal copy of what's called a slave inventory. Whites who had enslaved people had to keep, or they kept, what's called an inventory. About like one would his property, his cars, his cattle, his technology, his clothing, jewelry, etc. That's what this is. And the arrow that points to the man named Tom, that man was my great-great-grandfather. His name was Thomas Williams, and he was enslaved on the plantation. If you read from the top, this says inventory of the estate of Stephen Williams, captain. He was a captain in the Confederate Army. And it goes on to say deed. Some of this is kind of difficult to read. Returned to court, October term, 1849. Cash that he had on hand at that time, $30. Debts, I can't read that right off hand here. One note on Wells Sutherland in 1849, about $25. And on a second, I can't read that either, for about $75. And then we come to the word slaves. So he began to recount or list, enumerate those that he had enslaved. One male slave, Isaac, about 35 of age. One male slave, Tom, about 50 of age. That was my great-great-grandfather. He was enslaved on Stephen Williams' plantation. And after slavery was abolished in 1865, my great-great-grandfather and his wife, Emily Williams, continued to work on the Williams plantation. That was often the case when slavery ended, because the enslaved Africans were without anything to really build anything or to buy anything. So they often were forced to just stay there on the plantation of the person who had enslaved them and continue to work under conditions that were really slavery all over, quite frankly. So this is how real the system of slavery was. This is just one instance. This is one artifact from that period that shows you that this was the way it was. African people, African American people, were literally property, listed and enumerated as property in this country for 246 years, forced to lay the economic foundation for this country. And whites got a big head start from that 246 years of forced free labor of my ancestors. Which is why, no, I will not accept a 28-day period on the calendar to acknowledge my family's pain and toil and tears and blood to build this nation. Again, and you're going to hear it throughout this video, Black history is American history in 6 stages. Now, here is a larger pictorial of this slave inventory. And as you see, Stephen Williams had many enslaved people. Also notice that he didn't have a lot of cash, but he was wealthy in terms of the number of humans that he enslaved under the law. That's how intertwined slavery was in the economics of our country. African people, African bodies were the real wealth of this nation. This man didn't have a lot of cash, but he could sadly sell a human being and get cash for that sale. And in so doing, breaking up and destroying families. So don't talk to me about a Black History Month. Black history is American history. Now, I will take the opportunity to celebrate Black history during the month of February. I always do. But I'm wanting to make this point, and I'm wanting to make it forcefully. All right, let's keep looking. Stage 2. I'm showing you that throughout American history, there was Black history. The second stage of America was Jim Crow. Jim Crow. After the nation abolished slavery, white Americans enacted black codes that created systems and structures to maintain white power and to eviscerate Black power. So after slavery ended, after Reconstruction ended, whites, Southern whites, cut a deal with Northern whites, giving Northern whites the presidency, but allowing Southern whites to reestablish the Confederacy. And the Southern states began to enact black codes, black laws, that again created systems and structures to maintain white power and to eviscerate Black power. Because I want you to understand this. Just because slavery had been abolished, African Americans still did not have full equality. You could even say that they didn't have half of the equality that white Americans have or had during that time. You could say they didn't have 1/10 of the equality that whites had immediately after slavery. You could also say that white Americans collectively, not all white Americans, because some white Americans fought to end slavery. Some died. Some were out front. There were abolitionists who literally fought to end slavery. Some believed that blacks should have had full equality. But the white community as a whole, white society, white American society, has done just what is written here, and that is created systems and structures to maintain white power and to eviscerate Black power. And by the way, to you whites who say that I didn't own any slaves, my family didn't enslave any African people, any Black people, well, that doesn't absolve you, because as I said, the system of slavery gave whites tremendous advantages. All whites in this country. Now, of course, you got very wealthy whites who have benefited more than most whites, but nearly every white in this country has gotten some benefit from the institution of slavery in Jim Crow. And if they didn't, then that's their fault, because the system and structures have been in place. They've been in place to empower, to generate wealth for whites throughout. And it's the reason why the average white family today has a medium net worth that's about 10 times that of Black Americans. So the second stage, Jim Crow. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Jim Crow, but Jim Crow consisted of segregation laws, sharecropping, vagrancy laws that caused many African Americans to be sent to prison for very minor offenses so that they could become property of the state and could then be leased out by corporations and farmers, etc. There was redlining and many, many other things that went on during the Jim Crow period that essentially kept blacks in a state of perpetual enslavement. So that was stage 2. Stage 3, the civil rights movement. This is where African Americans did what we have always done, and that is resisted oppression and enslavement and second-class citizenship. We have fought, we have struggled because we were accustomed to freedom and dignity in Africa. And we were not about to come here and to willingly just submit ourselves to this system of Black degradation and subjugation and oppression. No, absolutely not. So that brings me to stage 3, and there were quite a few thousands, in fact, of slave rebellions. So don't ever accept this notion that Blacks submitted to and just succumbed to enslavement. No, we fought back. So Blacks demanded full equality and whites conceded with the passage of civil rights legislation. Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the EEOC, the Fair Housing Act. So that came about as a result of the civil rights movement. So that began with the Birmingham bus boycott, where Rosa Parks said, no, I'm not sitting in the back of the bus. And Blacks for over a year united and stayed off the bus and provided themselves transportation to and from work, to and from the grocery store, etc., until the Birmingham business community who ran the busing system and owned the busing system and owned the supermarkets said, okay, we give up. And they desegregated the bus system, which was really big, The only criticism I have of what Blacks did during that boycott was they should have stayed off the bus. They should have stayed off those white buses and developed a busing system of their own so that there would have been economic independency. We're now fighting that economic fight, that economic equality fight. That's where we are today. So that's the only criticism I would lobby about the Birmingham bus boycott. And I am very reluctant to offer that criticism because I so honor the men and women who were involved in that struggle. And then there was the voter registration, Dr. King, SCLC, John Lewis, to get African Americans voting, registered to vote, and then voting, pursuant to the 15th Amendment, which says, in essence, that the rights of Americans to vote should not be abridged, should not be violated. And as a result of that, the Voting Rights Act was added to give the 15th Amendment some teeth. We thank God for Dr. King and John Lewis and many, 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 many others. And then there was the desegregation of public schools. Of course, the late Justice Thurgood Marshall, who also was the lead attorney in the Brown versus Board of Education case, where the U.S. Supreme Court declared that segregation was inherently evil and effectively overruled the Plessy v. Ferguson case that essentially established this fake, separate but equal doctrine. So the civil rights movement made some achievements. There were others, younger fighters and warriors for justice like Stokely Carmichael, who wanted even more, not just desegregation or not just the right to vote, not just the right to sit anywhere on the bus, but Stokely talked about Black power, Black economic power, Black political power. And then there were those who were even pushing Black militancy, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, and so on. So the civil rights movement consisted of a lot of different parts that gained and made some progress, but not enough. So that brings us to stage 4, because what happened after the civil rights movement, which went into the 60s and most of the 70s, came the 80s, which started the white backlash. White backlash. And oh, by the way, there was white backlash after Reconstruction. So when I told you how Southern whites made and cut a deal with Northern whites to reestablish the Confederacy, that was in essence white backlash, because Southern whites again began to create this Jim Crow system to make sure that blacks stayed in that second-class citizenship status. So that was white backlash. And we've seen white backlash again in the 80s with the election of Ronald Reagan. I'm old enough to remember all of these things. I remember when Reagan was elected. I remember the 60s and the 70s. I was a small kid in the 60s, but I certainly remember the 70s. And then when Ronald Reagan was voted president, he was an adamant, blatant white supremacist. He even started his campaign. You know how Trump came down the escalators attacking Hispanics, Mexicans? Ronald Reagan did something about as shameful. He started his campaign in Mississippi, the town and the area where Emmett Till had been lynched. He started his campaign in that area, in that very city. And the intent of that was to reassure whites that all of this black civil rights stuff and this black power stuff and all of this black militancy stuff was coming to an end. Reagan was elected to stop that stuff. And if you think about it, the slogan, "Make America Great Again," was actually the slogan that Reagan coined first. He said the same thing. That's where Trump got it from. So in the same way that Donald Trump represents white backlash, that's what Reagan represented, and that's what he implemented. All right, let's go back to our screen here. So, regretting the concessions that they had made, a vicious white backlash began to attack and undermine those very concessions. What concessions? The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and all those concessions that blacks had gained from the civil rights movement. Whites said, hey, what have we done here? Almost like if you're familiar with the biblical story of how the children of Israel were enslaved and Pharaoh was forced to let them go, and then Pharaoh and the Egyptians regretted it and pursued behind the Israelites and were swallowed up in the Red Sea. Well, that was similar to how whites began to look at the concessions. First, the abolition of slavery, and then later on, about 100 years later, giving more concessions, the Civil Rights Act and all of that. And so they came out with this fierce, vicious white backlash that we are not unfamiliar with if we know history. They called it, in fact, redemption. Redemption. So blacks after slavery had Reconstruction. Whites created this ideal of redemption, the South redeeming itself from the loss of the Civil War and the loss of their enslaved people and their way of life. They were determined to redeem themselves. I just simply call it white backlash. And that's what we dealt with in the 80s. And how did it manifest itself? Well, a war on drugs. Nixon implemented this fake racist war on drugs. And if you don't think it's racist, I'm an attorney. I've represented people addicted to crack cocaine, and I have represented who are mostly African Americans, and I have represented people addicted to meth. And the difference, the way the court system treats those two drugs and those who use those drugs is stark. With those addicted to crack, who are mostly blacks, send them to prison. Prison, 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 period. Who cares if cocaine has an addictive agent? Who cares if It's really more of a public health type of situation, or at least that's what they said with meth, who afflicts mostly white people and the prescription medications. So now what you hear when you hear about meth and the prescription, the controlled substance, the prescriptions, what you hear a lot about, not prison, treatment, treatment, treatment. I mean, these folks are blatantly racist and don't care that you see it. I saw it up front. I saw prosecutors recommending 10 years, 15 years to someone who's crack addicted. I mean, that was the only issue. No real crime, maybe some petty theft to pay for the drugs, but go do 10, 15, 20 years at the expense of taxpayers. By the way, like the one case of a prosecutor, oh my God. I was representing this homeless dude who picked up a piece of scrap metal off a railroad track that had a value of $1.18, which was a misdemeanor. She recommended that he go to state jail for 18 months. 18 months for a piece of scrap metal that costs $1.18 and would have cost taxpayers tens of thousands of dollars to take care of this man as he laid there in prison. Make it make sense. And even conservatives here in Texas started seeing this makes no sense, no economic sense. And so they began to come up with alternatives. And that really got a boost when the meth epidemic occurred, because again, most of the people addicted to meth are whites. So we're not going to send whites to prison for 20 years for being addicted to meth. That was good for blacks. And if you recall, one of the most offensive things about the war on drugs was how not only were blacks disproportionately sent to prison, but they were sent to prison for longer periods of time. Stay with me. Let's go back to my screen here. Federal cuts and states' rights. Again, that was Ronald Reagan. The infamous welfare queen caricature that he created of black women, as well as the absentee black fathers. And we do have a lot of black children born out of wedlock, and that is an issue. Absolutely. But there are also studies, and I want to look you in your face when I talk to you about this. There are also studies that show that black fathers are more involved in the daily lives of their children than a whole lot of other whites, Asians, Latinos, etc. It's just that so many African-American men deal with so many other social and political and economic and employment issues that quite often it is just really, 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 really difficult for some of them to stand up and be the fathers that they need to be and oftentimes want to be. Now, of course, you got those, what my grandmother used to call those sorry men out there who are just making babies and then turning their backs on the babies. None of us care anything for those guys. None of us. But there are white men just like that. There are Hispanic men just like that. There are Latino men just like that. Asian men like that. Why is it that when you hear and see the image of the absent father, it is always the face of a black man? When again, the studies show that while black men may not be able to contribute economically as much as they want to, as much as some other groups of men, they're still very much involved in their children's lives. So let's just be fair in our criticism, is what I'm saying. I am not making any excuses for deadbeat dads. But I know this system. You don't go through all the stuff that I just outlined here and come out of that all peaches and cream. Black men have gone through hell in this country. And you can call that victimology, you can call that whatever you want to call it. It is a fact. And unfortunately, many of our brothers cannot stand up the way that they want to stand up. Because remember, systems and structures have been created to protect white power while eviscerating the black community, especially black men. And that, you can call that victimization. I don't care what you call that. I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. Police brutality. We've been fighting police brutality for many years. And part of that is because the police system here in America started out as slave patrols. The 1994 crime bill, Senator Biden, who is now currently President Biden. Yes, some of the issues that we see have come from both the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, in 1994, I remember how crack was really decimating the black community. I understand and remember that so well because I lost two brothers, two younger brothers, one 15 and one 20, who were in the streets very heavily during the height of the crack epidemic, scourge, whatever you want to call it. And when I say I lost them, by that I mean they got killed. And I preached their funerals. Two of my younger brothers, one again 15 years old when he was killed in the streets of New York City. And another one was 20 when he was killed in the streets down in North Carolina. All of this during the crack epidemic. So when I hear folks criticizing Joe Biden about the 1994 crime bill, parts of it need all the criticism we can muster, especially crack versus powder cocaine sentencing, right? So if a person got caught with 5 grams of crack, that person would be sentenced to 100 times worse outcome than the person who typically would be white with powder cocaine would get, although they got the same amount of the same stuff. That's how unfair it was. Now, there were blacks who supported the 1994 crime bill. And the reason why black politicians, black lawmakers supported the 1994 crime bill was because of all the devastation and the violence in urban black communities and rural black communities because of crack cocaine. It hit the black community like a storm. Like a storm. And what was most disgusting, I have to get a drink of water on this one. What was most disgusting was that the Reagan administration, the CIA, were part of the reason crack cocaine hit the black community in the first place. So on one hand, Nixon, Reagan, the GOP were talking law and order, war on drugs. On the other hand, they were helping bring in crack cocaine into the black community. And admitted it. This is not alleged. This is admitted. So spare me all the high moral talking, tongue lashing that they like to give the black community. Spare me all that. Because the U.S. government could be said is the biggest drug dealer in the country, helping bring cocaine into the black community. So yes, Joe Biden played a part in the 1994 crime bill, but let's be fair in our critique of that bill. It was real bad. Another part of it that was horrible too was the 3-strike provision, where if you got 2, You did some time, progressively more time. The second time you got popped, you got arrested, convicted. But the third time you were going to do a massive amount of time. And that third strike could be something as simple as some simple assault or something. Nothing real serious. It didn't require anything serious like that. Again, just walking in a store and picking up a candy bar and walking out could result in you going to prison now for 30 years. There are people still in prison because of some of those provisions. And it was under the Obama administration that those disparities, sentencing disparities, were dealt with. They're still not 1-to-1. Excuse me. Now they're 18-to-1 versus 100-to-1, but they still exist. But on the other hand, something had to be done to get the crack cocaine epidemic under control. And again, there were a whole lot of black lawmakers in the House of Representatives, and many of them supported the crime bill. So let's be fair in our critique of Joe Biden on that point. Mass incarceration, Clinton and Biden, right? When I say Biden, I'm talking about Senator Biden, President Clinton. He was president at that time when a lot of the mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex was created. And again, a lot of it had to do with the 1994 crime bill, as well as the crack epidemic, the war on drugs. All of that was going on at the same time. And mass incarceration has really wreaked havoc in the black community. No question. Of the over 2 million people who are incarcerated in America's prisons and jails, a disproportionate number of them are blacks, and a lot of them are innocent. And quite a number of them are actually in jail or prison because of small amounts of drugs, like I said, because of the 3 strikes law, that 1994 crime bill. So I'm going to be fair in my criticism of both Democrats and Republicans here, because the facts are the facts. The facts are the facts. All right. White fear. That is another relic of this civil rights stage here. White fear. Obama was elected, whites got scared, and elected Trump to put that genie back in the bottle, to stop the rise of the black community. And how did that go? How did that happen? SCOTUS gutted the Voting Rights Act because of white fear. And do you remember the George Floyd murder in 2020? And do you remember talks of a racial reckoning, where you saw a bunch of young people, whites, a lot of whites, out in the streets protesting the George Floyd murder, lynching, I call it. And folks were talking again about a racial reckoning. Instead of a racial reckoning after the George Floyd lynching, the GOP stiffened, got tougher, and said, no, 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 no. There will not be any racial reckoning. There will not be any racial reckoning. And they started all of their gamesmanship to make sure there would not be any racial reckoning. How did they do that? Well, they began to disparage, co-opt, and redefine terms that black academicians were using to fight racism, like critical race theory. They made that the boogeyman of the conservative movement. And they also co-opted woke and used that and weaponized that against African American people. Affirmative action they gutted here recently. All of this is a part of the white backlash. They're now focusing on destroying DEI programs and claiming that America's a meritocracy. How can America be a meritocracy when white people have had advantages from the very beginning of this country that we black folks worked to give them? So in other words, many of them have been in situations, many whites, especially white men, are in positions today, have made wealth today, just because they're white males, not because of any merit, but because they have certain white male privileges. And if we talk about the affirmative action programs, it was really white women who benefited mostly from the affirmative action programs, quite frankly. Stage 5, deflecting accountability. To shift blame and deflect accountability for 4 centuries of Black oppression, whites created and implemented a disinformation campaign to blame and gaslight Blacks for being powerless. So, whites created a very effective disinformation campaign. Part of it, again, was the critical race co-opting and the woke co-opting. But they are very skilled. White conservatives are very skilled at taking terms and words and flipping them on their head. Words that we have used to try to fight racism. Like, for example, the word racism, white conservatives flipped it into reverse racism, which is nothing. just to be blunt about it. It is nothing. It is nothing. Reverse racism is nothing but a ploy. Right-wing media, right? Fox News, social media, conservative advocacy groups like the Manhattan Institute, the Federalist Society. These organizations and think tanks are very, very, very effective at, again, taking the struggle for full equality and flipping it on its head. And then, of course, Black conservatives. Black conservatives have been recruited and handsomely rewarded to go out and defend white supremacy and to basically blame Blacks for the challenges that we have as a community. People like Clarence Thomas, probably the most effective given the seat of power that he's in. He took Thurgood Marshall's seat, and Justice Marshall was a warrior for justice. Clarence Thomas took the seat and became a warrior for white supremacy. Thomas Sowell, Candace Owens, Tim Scott, Ben Carson, and many, many, many more. This is the disinformation campaign that I'm talking about. And this represents the 5 stages of Black history that started in the mid-16th century and last until now. In other words, before there was an English colony, Blacks were here. So how are you going to take our contributions, our presence, our innovations and creations, and relegate all of that to 28 days out of the year? Black history is American history in 6 stages. Now, I've gone through 5. Here's the 6th stage. To be determined. Just where do we go from here? As a nation, we'll determine stage 6. Where do we go from here? Does our nation become more hardened in its white supremacist stand? Or does it say it's time that everyone has and enjoy full equality? So the 6th stage, in my estimation, is being written. And I'll end it with this. I'm not hopeful that full equality would be the pursuit of this nation if Donald Trump is elected. Because Donald Trump is a blatant white supremacist. And it's not just Trump. It's not just Trump, but it's those that he brings into office with him. I did a video several weeks ago about something called Project 2025. Go watch that video. But essentially, that video, I talk about how the conservative establishment are ready to come into office if Trump wins and pounce. Pounce in terms of getting rid of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, of getting rid of all DEI programs. And black folks, you may not understand how serious that is, but your jobs, your positions, your presence anywhere can be questioned because they can say you're there because of some diversity, equity, inclusion program, rather than being there because you can afford to be there or you're qualified to be there. And if the Civil Rights Act is gutted, then establishments, white-owned establishments, banks, grocery stores, car dealerships, et cetera, could say, we no longer sell to black people. That's the only reason why white-owned establishments cannot blatantly discriminate like that, because of the Civil Rights Act. The only reason. That's the only thing standing between us and no blacks served. That's the only thing that stops that. And there is a movement and there are individuals in the GOP party that are licking their chops, hoping that Donald Trump gets reelected so that they can take over these federal agencies and state governments as well. You know, they now control a majority of the state governments. And by the way, if they get enough of those and enough in Congress, they can make some major changes to the U.S. Constitution. I'm just trying to school you here. I'm just trying to help you understand what we are up against. So Black history is American history in 6 stages. We're not just some insular group that, you know, they can just say, here is 28 days for you all to do whatever you want to do. No. We laid the economic base for this country. We fought in every war. This is our country. Our history is American history, and American history is our history. You cannot separate the two. There is no American history without Black history. I am Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for listening. You have a good one. There'll be more content like this throughout the month of February. All right? Peace and have a good one.
That Corbin and Corbett legal team, fighting for the rights of the people. That father-daughter team, investing in the youth when the system ain't treating them equal. Providing truth for our people, we able to reach them. So anytime you get accused for a crime and Lord knows you ain't do it, we here to get you through it. Exemplifying prudence and glorifying God, making sure you're compensated for other people's doings. Our vision is to be one of the best. We're small enough to focus on your matter throughout the neighborhoods of Dallas. Working constantly and making sure your rights are protected. A firm team of lawyers, aggressive, effective. A team that has your back in the courtroom. 2 well-spoken Black lawyers in the courtroom. Investing time and resources when it's evident that you were treated wrong. Now you walking out of Dallas courtroom with a settlement. Corbin and Corbett, the father-daughter legal tag team that has your back in the courtroom. Our purpose is simple. To obtain the favorable outcome for each client and glorify Christ in all we do. Our vision is to be one of the best and most